Forget everything you think you know about medieval battles. This isn't the polished, slow-motion sword fights from movies. There were no perfect armors, no choreographed duels, no honor codes on the front lines. Real medieval combat was loud, filthy, brutal, and terrifying. Most soldiers weren't trained knights. They were poor farmers, forced to fight with tools they barely knew how to use. In this video, we dive deep into the raw, chaotic, and often horrifying reality of medieval warfare. From suffocating armor and crushing injuries to psychological trauma that lasted a lifetime. This is what battle truly looked like in the Middle Ages. Number 1. How soldiers were equipped and prepared. In medieval warfare, the image of the fully armored knight with a shining sword doesn't represent the reality for most soldiers. The majority of men who fought in battles during the Middle Ages were not professional warriors. They were commoners, peasants, farmers, tradesmen, pressed into military service by local lords or kings. Conscription was often mandatory, and these men had very little time to train, if any at all. In many cases, they didn't even get proper instructions on how to use a weapon before entering battle. The idea was simple. Show up, carry something sharp or heavy, and do your best to survive. The equipment they were given, if any, reflected their low status and the limited resources of medieval armies. The most common piece of protection was the gambeson, a padded jacket made of layers of linen or wool stuffed with cloth or horsehair. It was not stylish or impressive, but it helped absorb blows from blunt weapons and could reduce the severity of cuts. A well-made gambeson could offer surprising protection, but it was hot, heavy, and soaked up sweat and rain. For most soldiers, this was the only armor they had. Helmets were more commonly issued, but still varied in quality. Some were simple iron caps, others had face guards or nasal bars. For a peasant, even a basic helmet was a valuable possession. However, helmets were uncomfortable, limited visibility, and made it hard to hear, which was dangerous in the confusion of combat. Some soldiers wore makeshift protection, boiled leather caps or metal-reinforced hats, anything they could afford or find. Swords, often romanticized in modern depictions, were extremely rare among lower-ranking soldiers. These weapons were expensive to produce and required skilled craftsmanship. Owning a sword was a sign of status. Most common soldiers never had one. Instead, they carried spears, axes, or clubs. Spears were especially popular because they were cheap to make, easy to use, and effective in large formations. A long wooden shaft with a pointed iron tip could keep enemies at a distance and didn't require much training to use. When soldiers formed ranks, spears allowed them to hold a defensive line and resist cavalry or incoming charges. Axes were often repurposed tools, on the same ones used to chop wood, modified for combat. They could be single-handed or double-handed, depending on the user's strength. Maces, clubs, flails, and hammers were also used, particularly because they were effective against armor and didn't require precision to cause damage. These blunt force weapons were devastating at close range, and unlike swords, they didn't dull easily. Many peasant soldiers brought their own tools from home, which were then adapted for battle. Flails, originally used for threshing grain, were turned into weapons by attaching metal spikes or reinforcing the shafts. Sharpened shovels and pitchforks also found their way into battlefields. These weren't ideal weapons, but they were better than nothing, and often surprisingly effective in close combat. Shields were issued in varying designs, but most common foot soldiers received simple wooden ones. They were often round or kite-shaped and covered with leather to give extra durability. Still, these shields wore down quickly under the force of repeated blows and weren't as effective as the heavier metal shields used by wealthier warriors. Only the nobility or professional men-at-arms had access to more advanced protection. Chainmail was highly prized and made of thousands of interlocking iron rings. It could stop slashing attacks and reduce the damage from arrows or thrusts, but it was expensive, heavy, and required regular maintenance to prevent rust. Partial plate armor became more common in the later medieval period, but was still rare among common troops. Full suits of plate armor, the kind we associate with knights, were incredibly expensive and typically worn only by the elite. These suits were custom-made and could weigh over 25 kilograms, but they offered exceptional protection when worn properly. Number 2. What the battlefield was really like. Medieval battlefields were far from the dramatic, clean, open plains often shown in modern movies. In reality, these battle sites were messy, unpredictable, and extremely challenging for anyone involved. Most of the time, battles weren't fought on carefully selected ground. The location was often chosen out of necessity, determined by where the two armies happened to meet. If the enemy approached quickly or if a surprise encounter occurred, commanders had little choice but to fight wherever they were. That meant fields full of mud, narrow roads, forest clearings, riverbanks, or even rocky slopes. Terrain rarely worked in favor of the average soldier. The most common surface soldiers had to deal with was mud, deep, sticky, and dangerous. Especially in places like England or France, where it rained often, a field could turn into a swamp overnight. Historical records from the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 describe soldiers sinking into mud up to their knees, barely able to move. Armored knights, already carrying 20 to 30 kilograms of gear, found it nearly impossible to stay upright. Many didn't die from a sword or arrow, but simply collapsed and suffocated under their own weight, or were trampled by those behind them. Movement was one of the biggest challenges. On flat ground, marching was difficult enough, but on muddy or uneven terrain, it became almost impossible to keep formation. Rows broke easily. People slipped, bumped into each other, or got stuck. If you lost your footing in a crowd of men all pushing forward, there was very little chance of getting back up. Once the first lines clashed, formations dissolved into chaos almost immediately. A tightly organized army could fall apart in a matter of seconds. Vision was another huge problem. Helmets, while essential for protection, greatly limited what a soldier could see. Most had only small slits or holes to look through. Peripheral vision was nearly non-existent. That made it hard to react to sudden attacks or see approaching danger. Soldiers could only really focus on what was directly in front of them, and when the battle got chaotic, that wasn't nearly enough. It also made communication almost impossible. Once the noise began, metal clashing, people shouting, trumpets blasting, it became very hard to hear anything clearly. Even officers couldn't shout over the noise to give commands. Armies relied on flags or horns, but those signals were easy to miss or misinterpret in the middle of the fight. Another major issue was identifying who was on your side. In theory, soldiers wore colored emblems or carried banners with their lord's symbol. But in practice, those identifiers quickly became useless. Mud, blood, and sweat covered everything. A soldier who started the day wearing a bright tunic might look like everyone else after 10 minutes of fighting. This confusion often led to friendly fire, soldiers accidentally attacking members of their own side. Historical accounts show that some battles ended with significant casualties caused not by the enemy, but by allies mistaking each other for foes. The psychological strain of being on the battlefield was immense. The smells were intense and unpleasant. Sweat, blood, urine, and the metallic scent of iron filled the air. With bodies dropping around you, screams ringing out, and the constant threat of death, the stress level was beyond anything most people could imagine. Soldiers were not just physically exhausted, they were mentally overwhelmed. Fear, panic, and sensory overload made it hard to think or react. Many simply shut down and acted on instinct, doing whatever it took to stay alive. Number 3. What combat actually looked like. Combat in a medieval battle was nothing like the structured, cinematic duels people often imagine. It wasn't about precision or honor. It was about staying alive in a physically brutal and mentally overwhelming environment. Once two opposing lines collided, order disappeared almost instantly. Instead of coordinated formations or planned tactics, the battlefield turned into a chaotic crush of bodies where survival instincts took over. The actual fighting was extremely close quarters. Soldiers didn't have space to swing their weapons properly. In a packed melee with men pressed shoulder to shoulder, There was barely enough room to move, let alone perform wide sword strokes. Fighters often resorted to short jabs, quick thrusts, or overhead strikes. Large sweeping attacks like those shown in movies were nearly impossible in the middle of a real battle. You were too tightly packed, surrounded on all sides, often unsure where your allies were. The result was a kind of fighting that looked more like a street brawl than a formal clash of armies. Because of the limited space, weapons were used differently. Swords were sometimes gripped by the blade and used like hammers, striking with the pommel or crossguard to crush rather than cut. This technique, sometimes referred to as half-swording, gave better control and more force in tight areas. Maces, axes, and even improvised tools were common, and often more effective than blades. Blunt force trauma could injure through armor, whereas sharp weapons could be deflected or caught on chainmail. Helmets helped protect the head, but they were far from invincible. A hard downward blow with a mace or the heavy end of a sword could crack a skull even through a helmet. Many fatal injuries occurred when a fighter was already on the ground. Studies of mass graves from battles like Towton or Visby show that a large number of combatants died from downward strikes to the head and neck. This indicates that being knocked down in battle was almost a guaranteed death sentence. Once someone was on the ground, they were often stomped, stabbed, or crushed by others pushing forward. There was no opportunity to recover or retreat. The ground itself could become a hazard. Muddy fields made it difficult to stay upright, and if someone slipped, they became an easy target. There was no concept of fair combat. The idea of one-on-one duels was mostly limited to tournaments or rare nightly encounters. On the battlefield, 5 or 6 men attacking one enemy at once was completely normal. Soldiers aimed to overwhelm their opponents quickly, not to engage them honorably. The goal was to kill or disable the enemy as fast as possible, with as little personal risk as possible. If that meant stabbing someone in the back or finishing off a fallen opponent, so be it. In the chaos, it was often hard to tell who was who. Soldiers wore distinguishing symbols or colors, but these could be easily hidden or obscured by dirt and blood. Friendly fire was a real risk, especially in the panic and noise of close combat. Communication broke down quickly. Officers might shout orders, but few could hear them, and even fewer could follow them in the middle of a swirling melee. Exhaustion set in fast. Unlike modern combat with pauses and cover, medieval battles demanded continuous physical effort. Blocking, striking, shoving, and staying on your feet while wearing heavy gear. Within minutes, most fighters were drenched in sweat, muscles burning, breath short. Adrenaline might keep them going for a while, but it didn't last. Many battles saw soldiers collapse from fatigue just as often as from wounds. Number 4. How injuries happened and what killed most people. When we think of medieval battles, we often picture dramatic sword fights, clean blade strikes, and instant heroic deaths. But the reality of injuries on the battlefield was far more brutal, less cinematic, and more random. The majority of battlefield deaths weren't from swords slicing through bodies, but from things like blunt force trauma, crushing injuries, suffocation, and slow death from infections days after the battle had ended. Let's start with the weapons. Blades were deadly, of course, but not always in the way we think. A clean sword strike to a vital area could kill instantly, but that was rare. Most swords didn't slice through armor, especially not plate armor, which became more common during the later medieval period. Plate armor was designed to deflect slashes and absorb some of the impact, but it didn't make a soldier invulnerable. What it couldn't stop were the shockwaves and force from heavy weapons like maces, warhammers, or axes. These weapons weren't used to cut. They were used to crush. A blow from a mace to the helmet might not break the skull directly, but it could cause a concussion, knock someone out, or even cause internal bleeding in the brain. Strikes to the torso could break ribs, collapse lungs, or damage internal organs, all while leaving the armor apparently undamaged. Soldiers often died from these injuries hours or days later. In some cases, they didn't even realize the full extent of their wounds until it was too late. Chainmail, used before full-plate armor became widespread, was decent against cuts but poor against blunt force. A strong enough hit could drive the rings of chainmail into the flesh underneath, or simply crush bones beneath it. And once a soldier went down, they were in immediate danger. The battlefield was packed and chaotic. If you fell, you had only a couple of seconds to get back on your feet. Otherwise, you risked being stepped on by panicked allies or finished off by enemies. Many soldiers died not from a direct blow, but from being trampled in the mud. Helmets protected the head from direct hits, but they brought their own problems. Vision was limited to a narrow slit, and breathing was restricted. In longer battles or hot weather, heat could build up inside the helmet quickly. A soldier could become disoriented, dizzy, or even collapse from heat exhaustion or dehydration. This was especially dangerous during summer battles, where temperatures inside a helmet could rise to dangerous levels in less than half an hour. But even if a soldier survived the chaos of the battlefield, the danger wasn't over. In fact, for many, it was just beginning. Infection was the leading cause of death after the battle. Medical knowledge was extremely limited, and there were no antibiotics. A wound that would be easily treated today could turn deadly within days. Dirty weapons, contaminated hands, filthy clothing, all of it introduced bacteria into open wounds. Even minor cuts could become infected, leading to fever, delirium, and eventually death. Surgeons and battlefield medics did what they could, but their tools were basic, rarely cleaned, and often reused between patients. Cauterization, burning the wound shut, was common, but painful and not always effective. Amputations were frequent when limbs were badly damaged or infected. These were performed without anesthesia and often in unsanitary conditions, making survival far from guaranteed. Historical records from monastic hospitals and chronicles mention that for every soldier killed in combat, several more died in the days and weeks that followed. Blood loss, sepsis, tetanus, and other post-battle complications claimed thousands of lives. Many soldiers who appeared to have survived the fight collapsed hours later from internal injuries or slow bleeding. Injuries also weren't always obvious. Some soldiers took hits that didn't leave visible wounds but caused fatal internal damage. A sharp jolt to the head, a strike to the abdomen. These could rupture organs or blood vessels. Soldiers sometimes kept fighting, unaware that they were slowly dying from injuries that wouldn't have shown up on the outside. Number 5. What happened after the battle ended? Surviving a medieval battle didn't mean the danger was over. In many ways, the worst part came after the fighting had stopped. The battlefield itself was a grim and overwhelming scene, covered with the bodies of both the dead and the dying, weapons scattered across the ground, and the sounds of groaning, coughing, or quiet whimpers from those who were too injured to cry out. Blood soaked the soil, mixed with mud, urine, and whatever else spilled from wounded men. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, death, and excrement. For those who were still alive, there was little chance of immediate help. Most armies didn't have an organized medical corps. If there was anything close to a field hospital, it was just a makeshift tent or shelter where wounded men were taken if someone had the strength to carry them. The medical care available was extremely limited. Medieval surgery focused on speed, not precision. Infection control was not understood, and tools weren't sterilized between patients. Surgeons, often barbers by profession, worked quickly to remove limbs, stop bleeding, and cauterize wounds by pressing red-hot iron onto the flesh. There were no anesthetics beyond alcohol or biting a piece of leather. If a man was lucky, someone tied a tourniquet around his arm or leg to slow the bleeding. If he wasn't, he bled to death or died of shock. Pain was constant and overwhelming, but complaining didn't help. There was usually no one to listen. Most soldiers didn't get any medical help at all. Instead, they relied on fellow fighters to drag them away from the worst of the mess, or they lay still and hoped someone would notice. As soon as the fighting stopped, another kind of activity began: scavenging. Looting the battlefield was not seen as disrespectful. It was practical. Surviving soldiers searched the bodies of the fallen for anything of value. Weapons, armor, boots, belts, coins, and even food were taken. It didn't matter which side the dead had fought for, gear was gear. Swords and helmets were especially valuable. armor was expensive and rare, and even damaged pieces could be repaired and reused. Some men came out of battle richer than they went in, but many looted simply because they needed basic gear for the next fight or wanted to sell something to survive. The dead were often left where they fell. High-ranking nobles might be collected by their men or identified later and buried with some ceremony. But ordinary soldiers, especially peasants and mercenaries, were buried in mass graves if they were buried at all. In some cases, bodies were left exposed for days or weeks, picked apart by scavengers or animals. Chroniclers and archaeologists have found fields where bones and armor remained long after the battle, sometimes even being uncovered centuries later during plowing or construction. As for those who lived through the fight, there was little sense of triumph. Most were too tired to feel anything except relief. Wounds that hadn't been noticed during the chaos began to hurt. Shock set in. Men wandered the field looking for friends, many of whom were missing or dead. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others sat silently, too overwhelmed to speak. If there was any celebration, it was quiet and brief. The most common reaction was to drink whatever alcohol could be found. Ale, wine, or even something stronger if available. Drinking wasn't about celebrating victory. It was about escape. Soldiers drank to forget what they saw, what they did, and who they lost. There are accounts from battles like Wakefield or Towton that mention survivors drinking for days, sometimes in silence, other times breaking into loud grief. The mental and emotional damage was deep, though not well understood at the time. Number 6. Psychological effects and long-term impact. Medieval warfare didn't just leave physical wounds, it left deep and lasting psychological trauma on those who survived. Though people in the Middle Ages didn't have a formal understanding of mental health, the symptoms described by chroniclers, letters, and even clerical records show that many soldiers experienced what we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder. After returning from battle, men often showed signs of extreme emotional and mental distress. They were confused, forgetful, and sometimes unable to speak about what they had gone through. In some cases, soldiers stopped talking altogether or became withdrawn, refusing to engage with anyone. Nightmares were commonly reported, and some fighters would relive the battle in their sleep, screaming, flailing, or waking in a cold sweat. For many, the battle didn't end when they left the field. It stayed with them in their minds, playing over again and again, sometimes for the rest of their lives. These reactions weren't just observed among new recruits. Even experienced warriors who had survived multiple conflicts often admitted to overwhelming fear and anxiety before, during, and after fighting. Letters written by medieval commanders and knights occasionally mention how fear made men freeze or act irrationally. Some would break down crying, others would panic and flee. These responses weren't signs of weakness. They were natural reactions to the extreme stress and horror of combat. There were also physical consequences tied to this psychological strain. Many soldiers lived with long-term injuries, missing fingers, shattered bones that never healed properly, or nerve damage that caused constant pain. Chronic pain, coupled with mental trauma, could make daily life incredibly difficult. Some couldn't work or function normally in their communities after returning. Families sometimes describe these men as not the same, recognizing that the emotional toll had changed them. One of the most disturbing effects of medieval combat was the sheer randomness of survival. On the battlefield, death often seemed arbitrary. A man next to you could be killed instantly by a spear while you walked away untouched. This sense of unpredictability deeply affected soldiers, making them feel that life and death weren't in their hands. Some survivors were haunted by guilt, questioning why they lived when others didn't. Others resorted to desperate measures to survive, such as playing dead or hiding under the bodies of fallen comrades and enemies. These survival tactics, though effective, left a mental scar. Pretending to be a corpse or lying silently under a dead horse for hours was not something easily forgotten. Unlike today, medieval society offered little to no support for those dealing with this kind of trauma. There were no doctors trained in mental health, no therapy, and no real understanding of psychological injuries. A traumatized soldier might be seen as cursed, sinful, or even possessed. Some joined religious orders after battle, seeking peace or forgiveness. Others turned to heavy drinking to forget what they'd seen. Alcohol was one of the few accessible coping mechanisms, and chroniclers from the period often describe soldiers drinking for days after major battles, not to celebrate but to numb the pain, both physical and mental. Over the centuries, the physical evidence of these battles remained buried beneath the ground. Archaeologists have uncovered mass graves, broken swords, shattered helmets, and bone fragments, stark reminders of what these men endured. The stories of heroism and glory often fade when confronted with the brutal reality of fractured skulls and cut-down teenagers. These artifacts, found centuries later, confirm what survivors never had the words to fully explain: that the true legacy of medieval warfare was suffering.